well, just to start off today, every so often I like to, when we get notes, I like to share those with you all because the church does a lot of things for people, not just in the community, but around the world as well. So we do community stuff like collecting goldfish and applesauce packets so that kids can have meals. So the CCA is going to take that, put those into meals that they're going to give out to kids this summer who aren't in school. And then we're also going to be, as you saw on the slide, we're collecting Old Navy gift cards. That's going to go for the next couple months, really. So that way, when it's back to school time, they like to take kids shopping who otherwise couldn't afford new clothes or backpacks or things like that. And so we do community things, but then we also do things that impact the world as well. And like one of those I talked about maybe, I don't know, a number of months ago, where we had gotten a letter about how we help Bible translators, right? And it was a couple that was in Europe, and they were living there, but they were doing work translating the Bible into the Mariana Islands, which is located next to the Mariana Trench, right? The deepest point in the world. And so it was just kind of a cool thing, right, about how this church right here is impacting an island at the deepest point of the world, right, to help bring the word of God there. And so we got another one as well, and so I'm going to read it. It says, "Dear Live Oak Church, we are so thankful for you and your giving hearts. You are a huge blessing and encouragement. We serve at JARS in Waha, North Carolina." Now, JARS is the Jungle Aviation and Radio Service. So Jim, the husband, is the director of purchasing and logistics. He helped create our centralized purchasing department from the ground up for the last 3 years. Logistics, shipping, receiving, inventory, being added in October. He's working hard to bring the department up to speed in this quickly changing world of technology, and so we are so thankful to have a partner in helping make Bible translation possible while serving stateside. And Joy, his wife, stays busy homeschooling their 2 high schoolers and supporting Jim in his role. And then there's a nice picture of them as well, which I'm sure everybody can see. Brad, you just got surgery. Boom. All right. With your right eye, you can see it. But I highlight this because it's cool, you know, that we're able, we take a portion of what comes in to the offering every week and every month, and then we go and we bless others with that as well. And so yes, it goes to things like new microphones when we need them, or children's supplies, or youth dodgeball so that they can hit each other. But it also goes towards helping those in around the world as well. And so here it's going to this guy who's working in the Jungle Aviation and Radio Service, and what they do is they transport missionaries and linguistics into places and out. It used to be headquartered in Peru, now it's in North Carolina. And then they'll also help if there's disasters or hospital supplies, things like that, right? And so that's just a portion of what, you know, your giving goes to, is helping people here in North Carolina that help get supplies and people all over the world, especially when it comes to Bible translation. So I thought that was pretty cool. You can go ahead and turn in your Bibles today to Hebrews chapter 8. We're going to be there. And while you're turning there, so the other night, Friday night, I was playing hockey, as I like to do, and it was about in the 3rd period, and I was on the bench, and I just gotten off, and so I was tired, and I was drinking water, and the play was on the same side of the rink, but by the other team's bench. And all of a sudden, the official blows the whistle and just kind of points to the bench area, and I figured that a puck had flown over, which often does, so out of play, and so they'll stop the play, get a new puck, and everyone will line up. And so they kind of were getting ready again, and all of a sudden, because I couldn't really see through the plexiglass, but then all of a sudden I see one of the other players on the other team just collapse on the bench, and he was having a heart attack. And so instantly, we had 2 of our guys were right on the ice that knew CPR, and so one of them jumped over right away, and the other one got the AED kit, while the other one was giving him chest compressions, and they got the AED kit, and then some, you know, went to call the ambulance and open the doors and all that stuff to get ready. But it was kind of amazing how fast it all happened, right? And they tell you that when you are doing CPR on someone, right, you don't stop until the paramedics get there. And so this was going on a long time, like cycle after cycle, right, of compressions plus the AED kit going off. and he wasn't moving at all. And it was probably like the longest 5 or 6 minutes. And I know it was that long because someone on our team who records all of the plays that we do, he was videoing it, and so he had a video of this entire thing where you can see that chest compressions are being given, and the AED, you can hear that going off. And right before the paramedics show up, all of a sudden, the compressions worked, right? And everything worked, and all of a sudden he came back to. And it was about 5 to 6 minutes, right, of those cycles. And so it was kind of crazy. It was incredibly long, 5 or 6 minutes, right? Because you're just hoping that this guy is going to make it through. And then, especially for the people that are doing the work on them, because if you do the work and they don't make it, right, that stays with you as well. And so you're just kind of hoping and praying that everything's gonna work and he's going to come back to life. And all of a sudden he did. And so they asked him his name, and he said his name, and then he followed it up with, "And I scored a goal." But just like that, right? It's like kind of brought a stark reminder how in the course of everyday activity, all of a sudden our life can just vanish. It can just be taken from us. And so it was, again, a reminder that what we do here in this church and in this life actually really does matter, because in seconds, it can be over. And so when Jesus said, "Go therefore and make disciples," that does matter, because people get this life, and then once it's over, it's over. And so we've been talking about Hebrews, and we've been talking about faith, and how the author is imploring his audience to stay focused on Christ, because they're looking for what's better. And in this life, oftentimes we get so focused on looking at what's better that we can forget the mission that God gave to us. And so in Hebrews, you kind of find that perfect balance where he's remembering the mission that God gave, and he's trying to implore those that, hey, you've only got this one life. And so I know you're looking for things that are going to make it easier and things that are going to be better. And I know life is hard right now. You're being persecuted and you're being shamed. But you got to stay strong in the faith, because you get to this one life, and then it's over. And so often in our life, as we talked about last week, we started with, people are looking for what's better homes and better cars and better education, better, healthier foods, better, healthier drinks. We're looking for better coaches, better teams, better shoes, better clothing. Everything is looking for what's better. And so as we've been in Hebrews, and he's talking and dealing with people whose lives are difficult because they're Christians, they're thinking about going back on their faith, and what's better and easier for them. And as we talked about last week, he's like, Jesus is better. And so to the Jewish audience, because most of them are Jews that he's writing to, he's like, you're saying that you want to go back to Judaism, and you're wanting to go back to the law, you're wanting to go back to the high priest, but Jesus is our high priest, and he's better than the Israelite high priest for a number of reasons. And so the author last week highlighted all of them, and today he's going to continue to expound on that. Not only do we have a high priest that's better than any earthly high priest, but again, if we needed a new high priest, that means that high priest had to bring something better. Because you don't need a new, better high priest to enact an old covenant and an old law. And so it's like if Jesus was the new high priest, then he's got to bring something better. And so today the author is going to show us that what he gives us, that what the high priest gives us today, is better than anything the Israelites had. And so last week he was showing here's why Jesus as the high priest is better and what he brought. But here's why it matters on earth. And so it's another reason why we should remain faithful, and why we shouldn't go back on our faith and back to the world and back to what's comfortable, but we have to continue to follow Christ and remain in him. And so we're going to start in 8:1. It says this: "Now the main point of what we are saying is this: we do have such a high priest who sat down at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven." Did the high priest, when they were functioning in the temple, did they stand or did they sit? They usually had to stand. But Jesus, as the high priest, is sitting at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, and he serves in the sanctuary, the true tabernacle, set up by the Lord, not by a mere human being. And so not only do we have Jesus as a better high priest, but he's actually in the heavenly tabernacle, the heavenly tent or heavenly temple, whatever you want to say. And so if you're going to have somebody that's interceding for you, the author's saying to his audience, do you want to go back to have someone that's on earth and bringing their prayers and sacrifices and interceding for you here? Or do you want someone in heaven who's sitting at the right hand of the Father in that tabernacle, in the true tabernacle? Do you want him to be the one interceding for you? Verse 3, every high priest is appointed to offer both gifts and sacrifices, and so it was necessary for this one also to have something to offer. If he were on earth, he would not be a high priest, for there are already priests who offer the gifts prescribed by the law. And so Jesus, if he's a better high priest, he has to have something better to offer. And so their gifts are good, but they're inferior to what he had to offer. And of course, what did he offer? He offered his life, and it was blameless, and it was sacrificial, and it was perfect. And you can't offer anything better than that. So if Jesus was going to offer the same things the Israelite priests did, if he was going to perform the same rituals, there's no need for him to have ever come in the first place, because we already had that system. And so if Jesus came, and he's the high priest, he offered something better, and he gives us access to God in a way that the Jews couldn't if they were to go back. They serve at a sanctuary that is a copy and shadow. He's talking about the earthly first. They serve at a sanctuary that is a copy and a shadow of what is in heaven. This is why Moses was warned when he was about to build the tabernacle. So he goes back to Exodus. See to it that you make everything according to the pattern shown you on the mountain. But in fact, the ministry Jesus has received is superior to theirs, as the covenant of which he is mediator is superior to the old one, since the new covenant is established on better promises. So keep this slide up for a while, because this is big, and it's easy when we read it to just kind of gloss over it. But it starts with, they serve at a sanctuary, the earthly priests serve at a sanctuary that is a copy and a shadow of what is in heaven. Now, how many of you have read Exodus or Leviticus or Numbers or Deuteronomy, and you're like, man, I get lost in that? Because there's so much detail. And when you get to the part about the tabernacle and the tent and like what it should look like, you're like, man, like why does it matter what type of cloth they use, or why does it matter what type of materials and the dimensions and how they want things laid out and how they're to be transported and carried and set up, and like why do I need to know all of this? And why is there so much space given to it? Like, I understand today we live in a world where we can have paper instantly, but back then, right, to have a document, whether it was papyrus or paper, whatever it was, like that took a lot more work. And so to give that amount of space to the dimensions and the building of the tabernacle, like why? Well, it's because all of that was a shadow of what's actually the reality in heaven. And so God was like, Moses, you don't want to mess this up, because what you're building here is essentially a replica of what's up there. And so if you want to know what the tabernacle looks like in heaven, you go back and read the story of the dimensions, the cloth, and all that he gave to Moses. Right? He's actually showing us glimpses into heaven back in the Old Testament. And it's kind of mind-blowing to think about. And the author's going to come back to this. He's going to develop this over the next couple chapters of saying the things on earth are a shadow of the reality in heaven. Right? Because you can't have a shadow if you don't have the actual reality. And so God is actually giving us a glimpse into heaven. And then it makes me think of Jesus, right? He who has ears to hear, let him hear. And so to me, like we're getting into this section now, which is kind of like, oh my gosh, like I didn't realize that when I was a kid, and I didn't realize that when I was, kind of studying the Bible as a teenager, right? It's like, oh, that's kind of crazy and cool at the same time. He's going to go on, for if there had been nothing wrong with that first covenant, no place would have been sought for another. Now, the Jews would say that God gave the law to the prophets and that it was perfect. You didn't need anything else, which meant you didn't need Christ if you had the law. And you didn't need his teachings if you had the law. Like you needed the Messiah, you wanted him to come and rescue and save the nation. Right? But you had the law, and it was good, and it was perfect. So the author here is going to attack that premise and that foundation. And so he says, but God found fault with the people, and so he's going to attack the premise and foundation, say, even in the Old Testament, where it showed the glimpses of heaven, it also showed that the covenant and the law that is seemingly perfect is actually a little imperfect. And not that the law is imperfect, but it's a perfect law that imperfect people are trying to carry out. And so therefore, it's not fulfilling its full function. So he goes, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah. And if you're writing notes, you can write down Jeremiah 31 through 34. And so he goes back to one of the major prophets where this comes from, because at that time, Israel had rebelled and Babylon was coming in. And so you have Jeremiah, and he's speaking, and this is what Jeremiah writes down. He says, behold, days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. Not like the covenant which I made with their fathers in the day I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant which they broke, although I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. Right? This is Jeremiah 31. But this is the covenant which I will make with the house of Israel. After those days, declares the Lord, I will put my law within them and on their heart, and I will write it, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. They will not teach again, each man his neighbor, and each man his brother, saying, know the Lord, for they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity and their sin I will remember no more. And he's going to continue to expound this in the rest of chapter 8 here. But he takes it straight out of Jeremiah to say, you guys put so much emphasis and so much value on the law and the covenant, and it was good. But even to the prophet Jeremiah, God said something better is coming. Which means there's got to be something better than the old covenant that he made with Moses. And again, if you have what's new, what's better, why go back to the old? Right? Last week we talked about technology and phones in high school. When we talk about covenants, we talk about agreements. If you remember, after the landline, when we first started to get phones, right? It wasn't as easy as it is today. When we got Elizabeth a phone, we got her a phone, went to Verizon, said, give her a phone. Okay, right? Here's the phone line, and done. Super easy. But when cell phones first came out, you had to do your research on the agreements. Because before the iPhone and before the BlackBerry, you had a phone and a text. You had to do 2 times for B and 3 times for C. And so when you bought a phone, there were multiple things to consider. Number 1, how many minutes do you get? Because different companies gave you different amounts of minutes. The second thing is, how much do phone calls cost after 9 p.m.? Right? Because they had a certain amount of window. Usually it was 9, sometimes it was 7. But if you made calls outside of that window, then you got charged for the calls. And then number 3 was the coverage map. And so every company had their own map, and there were 3 different parts of that map. It showed you what was included in the range that you could make phone calls with, and then it showed you roaming, where you got charged when you were outside of that, and then it was like, you know what, we don't even cover this. All right, so there was a no coverage area. And so today, if you want a phone, it's easier. Now I don't have to go back to worrying about, like, where am I on the coverage map? I'm going to get charged for this, and what time is it? Because it's 9:01, oh no, can't make the phone call, got to wait till the next day. Now you don't have to worry about that anymore. Now it's basically, do you want unlimited data or do you not? But you can pretty much go anywhere now, and the phones will work. And so again, why would if I have this agreement now, why would I want to go back to trying to sort through all of those questions and that agreement? Because I don't want to go back to having only a certain number of minutes and being able to text or call in a certain window. And I don't want to worry about, am I in coverage, or am I roaming, or do I even have coverage at all? Like, those agreements worked back then, but they don't work now. I don't want to go back to that. And that's what the author is saying. He's like, just like you had something better, you also don't want to go back to that same agreement, that old agreement, because it worked for a while, it was useful, but it is no longer useful in light of what has come. Verse 9, it will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they did not remain faithful to my covenant. And I turned away from them, declares the Lord. Right? Because they didn't remain faithful. They turned away from him. And so he's like, fine, you're going to go your own way? Go your own way. So the old covenant was good. It said God would provide for them, that he would lead them, that he would protect them, that he would bless them. Everything that you could want, if God were to make a covenant with you, was in that Mosaic covenant. But they rejected it. And they weren't faithful. Which means that you and I can have a really good relationship with God, and it can still fail. Because we think, if only God would do this for me, if only God would lead me, if only he would bless me, if only he would give me peace, then I would trust him with everything, and I would follow him wholeheartedly. But Israel had that, and they still walked away. And they had seen God work more in their life than many of us have, and they still walked away. And so they broke the agreement, the covenant, and accepted its consequences. But God is relentless in his love, and even our disobedience isn't a deterrence to him. And so he tries to give us everything he has in store for us. And so God says, you know what, I'm going to make a new covenant in the future. Verse 10, this is the covenant I will establish with the people of Israel. After that time, declares the Lord, I will put my laws in their minds and write them on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. And so the new covenant is better, and it's greater, and it can be kept in a way that the old one couldn't and wasn't. The old law, the old covenant, was all external. The new one is better because it's internal. And this is also why, for many of you, when you see things in the world, and where the world is going or what it's doing, it's so frustrating. And you can't figure out why. It's because God's law is in your mind and it's written on your hearts. And so when something conflicts with that, you're like, that's not right. And so you're having this struggle of a heavenly heart in a fallen world. And the more we get to know God, the more we know his ways. Right? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. And so that's why you can look around and be like, how come you don't get it? Right? It's not written on their minds, it's not written on their hearts. Because this is actually the sign of a more mature covenant. Like when my kids were smaller, we told them rules. Don't run into the street. Don't throw the toy. Go to bed. Go to bed. If it's Elizabeth, we did that 3 more times. Go to bed. And all those rules are for their benefit, for their health, for who they will grow up to be. Now that they're going into middle school and high school, yes, they need external rules from time to time, like go to bed. But it's even better when they put that understanding of where they need to get that good night's sleep, and they just come down and say, I'm going to go to bed now. Right? Because they understand it went from external to internal of I need rest and I need sleep. Or, just being kind, right? You can tell a kid to be kind, but it's different when they tell you something, or you hear something from one of their teachers where they helped somebody else and they were just kind, right? That's an internal law written on their hearts and their minds. And so, that's what we want, right? That inward law that is more mature and takes more maturity, and that's what God wants for us. And we can now, because we have the Spirit of God in us. He gave that to us. He doesn't have to treat us like kids anymore, saying, don't hit, don't steal, don't be jealous, don't lie. He's like, you have the Spirit of God in you, and so now I can give you something that's for the mature. And you can know it, and you can live out God's ways. Verse 11, no longer will they teach their neighbor or say to one another, know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, for I will forgive their wickedness, and I will remember their sins no more. So no longer will they teach their neighbor or say to one another, know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least to the greatest. In the past, who knew the Lord the most? The Jews, and who specifically within the Jews? The priests and the Levites. But once Christ came, if you follow him and believe he is who he says he is, because of the new covenant, you get God's law on your heart and your mind, and you have the ability to know God whoever you are, wherever you are, whatever your past. Doesn't matter. You get the ability to know God, and in a better way than the Jewish priests and Levites did. And so it doesn't matter your status, it doesn't matter your income or your education level, it doesn't matter how long necessarily you've been in church, it doesn't matter what you give away or what you do or your job or your education or your awards or anything like that, because from the least to the greatest, all can know God. And he doesn't just say they will know me, he says I will forgive them their wickedness. Not even their mistakes. Right? It's like, I will forgive their wickedness. So whatever wickedness you've done or said or thought, God forgives that. All right? The worst thing you could do or have done, God under his new covenant will forgive you. And of course, there are consequences that you might have to deal with. But our holy and righteous God, if he forgives us, everything's good. And so those sins that you keep coming back to and struggling with, he's not going to hold that against you. Not because you're so perfect, right? But because Christ is, and when we put our faith in him, we get the benefits he procured while on earth through his death and his resurrection. And so we get the grace, and we get the favor, and we get the love, and we get the future. And then the author drives home his point with this final statement. By calling this covenant new, he has made the first one obsolete. And what is obsolete and outdated will soon disappear. And so the author is like, why would you want to go back to that one? Because it's obsolete, and it's outdated, and it's going to disappear. Now, Israel's temple and priesthood is going to pretty much become obsolete very soon. They fall away with the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. But he's like, I know you're thinking about going back. And if you're from Judaism, that means you're thinking about going back to the law and the priesthood and the sacrifices. And if you're a Gentile, then you're thinking about going back to your temple with the gods that you would serve in the way that other Gentiles are living. It's like, but you got to understand that because of Christ, when he came with a new and a better covenant, that made the old one obsolete, so why would you want to go back? And although most of us today, we're not going to go back to the old covenant with its laws and sacrifices. Most of us would fit those in the original Hebrew audience who came more from the worldly perspective. Right? And sometimes it can be tempting and feel easier to abandon faith, especially when it's against culture. It's difficult. But the point of this section is, why go back when you can have what's better? Right? The old way, when you screwed up, you had to bring sacrifices for your sins. The world still thinks the same way. You screw up, well, then you need to sacrifice your job or your career or your friends or your family, but you need to pay for it. You make a mistake, you got to sacrifice. The new covenant says, because of grace, your mistakes don't have to be a source of shame and regret. Right? They can be a purpose for your future, and they can lead you, if you'll let God lead you, into the plan that he's got in store for you. When I ask the students about self-image or promises, one of the ones that always pops up, which Kenny often mentions, but other students mention as well, is the one that Mr. Larry teaches them in Treehouse. Which is what, Mr. Larry? For you are God's masterpiece. Right? Each person in here is God's masterpiece. Now, the other great artist, Bob Ross, if he made a mistake, what would he do? Right. Okay, well, that one's going to be a bird, right? And God can do the same thing with our mistakes. We think they're a blemish on an otherwise good masterpiece. Oh, I was doing so well, but then I messed this up, and so my career, or relationship with your kids, or whatever it is, or your health. And we think that we just destroyed the masterpiece. And God's like, no, we can actually use that, and we'll just make that a little bit better. If we'll let him. And so we choose. Where do we want to go? Do we want to go back to the old covenant with its shame and regret and everything's riding on me and what I do? Or do we walk in the new covenant that Christ came because he's a better high priest? And so yes, life can be hard and it can be difficult to follow God and stay faithful. And it can feel like it's going to be easier to just give up and settle, and you know people in your life who have done just that. And they've walked away from God or they've walked away from church. But don't go back. You don't go back. Because what Christ brought is better. So don't go back to the old way when you have the opportunity of the new before you. Right? To the Jews, he's saying, why go back to the old covenant when you have the new? To the Gentiles, he's saying, why go back to the things of the world when you have the better that Christ offers? And to us, he's saying, don't give up, don't turn around, don't go back, don't give up, because you've got something better. And so yes, it's hard, and yes, it's frustrating, and yes, people are going to say things about you, and yes, you're going to feel shame for what you believe and the person that you follow. But he's like, ultimately, it's so much better. And so don't give up. Let's pray. God, as we're here this morning, some of us are perhaps struggling with just making it through the week. Sometimes just making it to church on a Sunday is a win. And sometimes we don't even realize the struggles that people have in this church of being able to make it on a Sunday to worship you. With opposition from friends or family, or just within, or feelings of inadequacy or shame or guilt. And sometimes we don't realize how that affects us throughout the week as well. And so we struggle there to stay close to you. And so I pray that for all of us, when we have those times when we think, you know what, let's just compromise, or let's just give up, let's just go back, that you would remind us that Jesus is better. Jesus is greater. The new covenant gives us more than anything else we could ever want. And so help us to remain faithful, and give us strength, give us confidence. So as we finish up today, I ask that you would help us to remember that throughout the week, that Jesus is better, the new covenant is better, and we don't have to go back. And even though we might want to sometimes, help us to quickly put in perspective all that we have in you, and then help us to help those around us who are struggling as well. In Christ's name, amen.